That night spent with my son Henry was easily the wildest yet most thrilling night my I have experienced ever in my life. My name is Michael, and I wish to share an account of an event that occurred between my son Henry and me. It isn't easy to discuss, but it's something I've kept Henry inside for too long, 19 now. But it all began a few years after the passing of my wife. Losing Barbara was among the toughest things I have encountered, and it left Henry and I alone to steer through life without. It was initially difficult for Henry, spending the majority of his time withdrawn and quiet time spent in his room or hanging out with friends. He steered clear of mentioning Barbara or anything related to her death, and I didn't want to pressure him. Instead, I concentrated on ensuring our home felt as warm and made it as inviting as I could. I prepared his meals you loved, left little notes of motivation on his desk, and attempted to ensure he was aware of my support for him, if he had to talk. But for months he kept his distance. Then one evening he entered the kitchen while I was cleaning up post-dinner. His abrupt presence surprised me, but I was glad to see him. It wasn't frequent that he pursued me out like this. "Do you need help, Dad?" With his voice sounding soft but steady, he asked. "I turned you sure," him surprised by the offer can dry the dishes, I said, offering him a towel. We toiled in quiet for some time, and I felt a small feeling of relief. It was the first time he had willingly spent time with me, and it felt like an eternity. How was school? Today I inquired about initiating the conversation. He said it was fine without. That was all I looked up. "I didn't push. If you want to talk further, I'm here," I added, glancing at him gently. I saw him nod out of the corner of my eye, but said nothing further, and over the next couple of weeks, I began to notice small changes. Henry started to spend more time near me, sitting with me in the room as I was watching TV or assisting me with minor chores at home. He even started to share with me about his courses and his college plans. I experienced a faint sense of hope, as though we were eventually discovering our route back to a few somewhat normal. But then one night an event occurred that caused me to question everything we had for dinner that evening. Henry had prepared an easy pasta recipe he had picked up from a friend while we were eating. He glanced at me and said, "You're an amazing dad." I laughed a slight dismissal of the praise. "Thank you, Henry. That means a lot to me." Attempting to maintain a light tone, but his expression unchanged, he looked at me with a force that churned my stomach flip. "What's the matter?" I inquired gently. "But careful," he said nothing quickly with a shake of his head. I expressed my gratitude for everything with a nod, though I was uncertain of how to react to the moment. Felt it was odd, yet I said to myself that he was simply being nice. So he was overthinking. It wasn't the crazy night hadn't yet occurred. But this was certainly the begin for it, because following that evening, things began to shift as Henry started to find yourself hovering around me more often. Justifications for sitting next to me on the couch, or stay in the kitchen while I prepared food. Initially, I thought it was sweet. I told he was simply attempting to reconnect with myself after all the time we had spent mourning in our individual manners. But then there were the appearances on which his gaze would rest me longer than they should, his compliments occurring more often and more personal. "You look really nice today," one morning, he said as I stood at the sink. "Which is used for washing dishes, thanks, dear," I answered, attempting to maintain the tone was light, but the way he said it I felt uneasy because of the way he looked at me. One night we were lounging on the sofa viewing a film that Henry had selected, a comedy that we've both watched a dozen times. I recognized he was before I reached the midpoint of the way through. Our shoulders were nearly touching, and when I moved a little, but he did not move away. "You're always so busy," he said suddenly. "You never take time." Breaking the silence, I smiled a little. "For yourself." "Caught, that's what fathers do, Henry. Catch you off guard, there's always something that needs attention." He shook his head while keeping his eyes on me. "You do a lot, and you deserve a break." My chest tightened at the words. "That's sweet for you to say," I responded, "but I'm fine truly, and I was unable to sleep that night." Remained in bed, looking at the ceiling, replaying the moment repeatedly in was it simply an innocent gesture or war? Ich mir etwas mehr vorzustellen? Was war occurring between us I would soon discover in the ensuing days. I observed Henry looking for excuses to spend more time close to me, and even more so if I was cooking. He would come into the kitchen to converse if I were in the garden. He would go outside and sit with me. His compliments continued each one that makes me feel more unsettled. And to be honest, I saw myself doing the same, more often too. "You make this house?" he said to feel alive one afternoon as I folded. I froze for a moment, not certain about how to reply. "Thanks, Henry," I said, finally managing to smile, but deep down I was unable to rid myself of the feeling that something was shifting, but not in a way I felt at ease with the discomfort I experienced, became larger and larger. I attempted to inform I was envisioning things that Henry wore einfach nett. Vielleicht sogar versuchte zu compensate for the distance between us following Barbara's passing. But it was not only the flattery, it was how he behaved. How he always appeared to be around me there observing me, searching for justifications to exist nearby, and I hadn't fully worked out yet why I also did that to him. In the afternoon, I was preparing food in the kitchen while I was chopping vegetables for dinner. I heard Henry followed me in, his footsteps soft on the tiled floor. I did not turn while I was attempting to concentrate on the job available, hoping he would just take a snack and leave. "Do you need help, Dad?" he inquired. I cast a quick look over my shoulder and offered him a quick smile. "Of course, you can cut these carrots," I said, sliding the cutting board. He stepped up beside me, his gaze directed toward him. Actions intentional and commenced slicing. We worked in silence for a while. I had the impression that it would simply be a calm, pleasant moment, something usual, but then he ceased cutting and turned to look at me. You've done so much for me." With his voice low, I glanced at him as he spoke, baffled. "What do you signify? I mean following." "Since Dad passed away, you have managed everything." "He said you didn't have to, but you did." His gaze locked onto me. I experienced a pang of emotion in my chest. "Naturally I did." "I told you, Henry, that I love you because you're my son." He nodded, attempting to maintain a steady tone, but his gaze didn't waver. "I just don't think I ever expressed gratitude for all of you." "Don't need to thank me," I said rapidly, turning back to the stove. "That's what dads do." He didn't respond, but I could sense his gaze on me. The instant seemed excessively burdensome and intense, and I wanted only for it to end at last. He grabbed the knife and began recutting, and I emitted a tiny after-dinner relief. That night I sat on the couch with a book, hoping to immerse myself in the pages that Henry entered the lounge and took a seat next to me, not located in his usual position on the other end of the couch, but immediately beside me. "What are you reading?" he inquired, leaning in closer. "When you look at the cover." "It's merely a novel," I stated, elevating it so he could see. "Nothing too thrilling." "Can I go through it with the question you asked?" Caught me off guard. Henry had not displayed much interest in reading since childhood, and I couldn't recall the last time we had accomplished a joint effort on a section like this. Of me wished to decline. To inform him I needed some personal time. But another ein Teil von mir wollte ihn nicht wegstoßen. Of course, I mentioned moving over a bit to allow him more space. He moved in near his shoulder, lightly touching mine as I started to. When read aloud, at first it felt like any other moments we could have shared for years in the past, prior to everything becoming so complex. Yet as time went by, I grew more cognizant of how near the intensity of his watching me. Not the book. After I completed the chapter, I shut the book and put it down. "That's sufficient for tonight," I said, attempting to maintain my voice as light. "Thanks for listening to me," he said, with a soft tone. "You're welcome," I responded while getting up and going toward my bedroom. "Sleep well." "Henry, sleep well." He said Dad. But there was something in his voice, was something I couldn't quite location. But the following morning when I arrived in the kitchen, Henry was already present. He had prepared coffee and laid out breakfast, something he had not done for years. "Which was good morning, Dad," he said, his voice cheerful. "I made you some coffee." "Thanks, Henry." Cautiously stated while taking a seat at the table, he observed me from across as he said, "I took a sip. You work so hard. Out of the blue, you are worthy of being looked after." I also swallowed hard, uncertain of how to. I replied, That's very sweet of you. Ultimately, but you aren't required to do everything this for me. I want to, he said. Told after breakfast, I firmly retreated to the garden, hoping to clear my mind. The air was fresh and the fragrance of flowers in bloom. I sat on the bench surrounded by flowers. Gazing at the carefully cut hedges, attempting to understand everything, I konnte nicht sagen, wie lange ich schon gesessen hatte at that moment. Upon hearing footsteps behind me, I looked to see Henry approaching me with his hands in his pockets. Can I sit with, he asked you, and of course I said yes. Part of me wanted to refuse. He took a seat alongside me, leaving a small gap in between for a time. We were quiet, the sole noises emanating from the rustling leaves and far-off birdsong. You have been. It's been quiet lately, he said at last. I kept my reply short, as I had a lot on my mind. I stared at the garden. What was it about? Me? Preguntó con un tono suave pero serio. I was taken by surprise by the question, and I paused prior to responding as to why you would think that he shrugged. I don't know. I just feel like I might have done something to disturb you. You haven't disturbed me. As I stated, he nodded, saying he had been tired quickly, but remained silent. After a few, he stood up for more minutes. I'll leave you. He said alone, his voice quiet. I watched him walk back into the house with a knot of guilt developing in my chest that he hadn't caused. There was nothing wrong, Haiti, so why did I feel how uneasy the days that followed felt, as if a dense cloud had settled above the house? I attempted to behave, cooking normal meals, tidying up and going regarding my typical routine, but I was unable to shake off the tension I experienced. Whenever Henry war in der Nähe, hatte nichts unternommen, obviously incorrect, yet he remained in a manner that seemed different. And then, on one night, I deliberately tried to maintain some distance after dinner. I withdrew to my bedroom sooner than as usual, hoping for some quiet time to I myself curled up with a book, allowing the gentle illumination of the lamp creates a small. It felt like a rare, warm cocoon. Respite from the disquieting dynamic which had started to develop, I experienced tension and a thrill within me. When pondering concerning Henry and I had never before acknowledged, it took me by surprise, as I couldn't come to terms with the fact that Henry war mein eigener Sohn, aber gerade als ich anfing zu relax, es gab ein sanftes Klopfen an der Tür. Dad! Henry's voice was almost low hesitant. I was reluctant to respond right away. Yes, may I come in? I stole a quick look at the clock. It was late, well beyond the time Henry normally went to bed. Is something wrong? I inquired while propping oneself up a bit. I wanted to converse, he stated. I sighed while adjusting the setting. The door opened with a creak as I set my book aside open, and Henry stepped inside. He looked different, in a way that is less like he usually depicted a self-assured young man, and more like the boy I used to console after having nightmares as a child. He remained in the doorway for a moment. While uncertain about approaching, I asked, he sat down on the edge of the bed. Actions unhurried and intentional for at that moment. He didn't speak. His eyes, he was fixed on the floor, then looked up with his gaze meeting mine. I only wanted to tell him. I'm sorry, he said at last, for what I cautiously requested my voice for creating you. His tone indicated discomfort genuinely. I realize that my behavior have changed recently, and I don't want you to believe I'm attempting to make things awkward in our midst. I blinked in surprise at his Henry. I started with honesty, but he interrupted me. I've just been feeling a lot of things, and I'm not entirely sure how to handle them, he stated, his tone slightly cracking. But I don't wish to his words hurt you. They hung heavily in the air, whose meaning I couldn't fully grasp. I extended a hand onto his shoulder. Henry, it's normal to feel sometimes. I gently said, confused, but you must keep in mind that I'm your father, and our relationship has limits. He nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I know, I'm sorry, he said again. My voice was hardly louder than a whisper, as I gave his give a reassuring squeeze before withdrawing my hand. Let's not be concerned about it anymore. I said, trying to maintain my tone, we'll work it out together. There existierte eine gewisse Anspannung und Aufregung among us, That I couldn't fully identify the expression in his eyes indicated there was more was coming. And I gave that same look. He also nodded again in response. Dad said while standing up, "Good night." I watched softly before leaving the room, him feel a strange mix of relief and he had sadness settling over me. Recognized the strain in our relationship that seemed to be a move in the correct direction, but I found myself wondering whether things would genuinely revert to normal. One thing was certain to me, and that this was not the final occasion. He would do this, and I was correct. I was certainly correct regarding the next time if this were done, many things would come to an end in a different way, and the following morning I awoke up feeling more drained than normal. The talking with Henry had kept me lying awake for hours, my thoughts racing with what ifs and unresolved questions I came up. With completed my morning routine and attempted to dispel the residual discomfort, Henry appeared to be different that day, more subdued. More reserved, he tended to keep to himself, remaining in his room for the better part of the day. Part of me wanted to check up on him, too, ensure he was fine, but another part of me hatte ich das Gefühl, ihm etwas geben zu müssen. Space that night while I was folding laundry in the living room, Henry entered without saying anything. He took a seat on the couch. A word observing me in silence while I toiled, the silence separating us was oppressive, and I had difficulty coming up with something to say. I finally said, "You've been quiet today." He glanced at him and shrugged. I am considering something specific." Asked, making an effort to sound casual regarding us, he uttered, "Hi," his voice scarcely rising above a whisper. Froze momentarily, the burden of his words sinking in. "What do you imply?" He hesitated, his eyes carefully asked, meeting mine. "I know that things has been strange recently, and I want to avoid it." He said to not be like that anymore, and I nodded slowly, uncertain of my response. I don't want that. I finally said it, but we must determine how to proceed. He nodded, a slight smile crossing his "we will" lips for a brief moment. He said, "I experienced a brief spark of hope that perhaps things would improve. Perhaps we could relocate, overcome this, and discover a method to reconstruct our relationship. Yet I couldn't, at my core, shake off the feeling that we were standing at the brink of something I didn't completely grasp it. Or perhaps I did grasp it, but I was not ready to accept it yet." Silent disquiet that had taken hold of the Henry attempted to act as the house remained. Normal, but I could see the struggle in the way he hesitated before, his eyes talking or stayed too long when we intersected with my route. I wished to have faith in the apology barbered the end of everything, yet I was aware on a deeper level that it was not the case easy. And then one night while I was lying in bed while scrolling on my phone while trying to unwind, it happened once more. It was late, and the house was quiet apart from the gentle creak of the ceiling fan above me. I had only just started to doze off when I heard a soft rap at the voice of my dad, Henry, came through the bedroom door, soft and nearly uncertain. I propped myself up, my heart. As he asked if he could come in, I sank. Took a brief look at the CL. It was long after Henry. It's late. Midnight already. I was attempting to maintain a firm tone. What is incorrect there? Es gab eine Pause bevor antwortete. Ich habe no need to discuss something with you. Regarding his voice caused me to hesitate. I inhaled deeply, take a breath, then said, "Okay," and entered through the door. Henry stepped inside as it creaked open. He appeared to lack confidence, his hands stuffed into his pockets while he remained close to the entrance. "What is it, Henry?" Why, he asked. Trying to keep my voice steady, hesitated, with his gaze flickering between. I've been between me and the floor, giving much thought to what I said the other night. He started off with a low voice, and I feel the need to be truthful with you. I felt my chest tighten, being sincere about. He stepped closer to what I asked. Carefully taking a seat on the bed's edge concerning my feelings, he expressed himself with his voice. I tremble a little, knowing it's not right, and I attempted to disregard it, but I am unable to stop. When I thought of you, Dad, I caught my breath. I stared at him, my mind in my throat racing. Henry, you can't. I started, but unterbrach mich. Ich weiß, dass schnell sagte, sein voice brimming with desperation. I know it's incorrect, but I can't help it. You have been since Dad died. You are everything to me. You are kind and strong, and you have accomplished so much as for me. I don't know how to stop feeling in this manner. His words struck me like a felt, as though I was frozen and unable to respond to the physical blow act or talk, while his confession lingered in the air. Henry, you're my son, I said at last, my voice trembling. I love you, but not in that way. This needs to end. I know tears welled up in his eyes as he whispered, I just needed to inform you that I got in touch. Henry putting a hand on his shoulder. What you are experiencing is due to everything we have experienced. It is not truly, you are both young and confused, but this is incorrect. We need to collaborate by doing this together. He nodded, his shoulders drooping. He apologized gently. I had no intention of causing you pain. I understand. I expressed my heart breaking at the sight of him, but we cannot allow this to go on. Henry, you are a good person, and you will. He moved past this and wiped his eyes. He slowly stood up. Good night, Dad uttered with little volume. He wished her a good night. I answered while watching him exit the room and shut the door behind him as soon. After he had left, I locked the door and sat down. I was lying on the bed, my hands shaking. Was unable to accept what had just occurred. I was inundated with guilt and bewilderment, doubting everything I possessed carried out that could have resulted in this instant. I loved Henry wholeheartedly, but his emotions were something I couldn't disregard or reject. That night, I hardly in my sleep, I kept replaying his words. Head attempting to comprehend them, I informed for me. It was merely a phase, a fleeting instance of confusion that would eventually fade. But deep down. The following morning, I wasn't certain about Henry's presence. He was quiet, hardly saying anything at breakfast, and upon his departure for school, I sensed an odd blend of relief and sadness. I dedicated the day to attempting to concentrate on work. But I found my thoughts wandering back to our dialogue. I couldn't get rid of having the impression that this was not finished when he came home that evening. He seemed distant, averting one's gaze and withdrawing to seinen Raum. Fast augenblicklich wollte ich talk to him to ensure he was okay, but I felt uncertain about where to begin. Caught with no idea of how to deal with the situation without exacerbating the problem that night later on, I was seated in the lounge room, gazing at the television, devoid of the house was quiet. So I was really watching it, and I could sense the burden of everything that was weighing on me all of a sudden. Footsteps were audible behind me. I turned to observe Henry positioned in the doorway, his expression illegible. Can I join you, fragte. Ich zögerte einen Moment, before with a nod, he naturally ambled over and took a seat lying on the couch, leaving a small gap. We sat in silence together for a while. The strain between us was nearly intolerable, he said finally, his voice soft. I don't want to lose you. You won't, I said fast. But we must establish limits, Henry, for both of us. He nodded slowly, his gaze directed at the floor. I understand. I contacted him by putting a hand on his knee. We will overcome this, I said gently, but you must believe me. He gazed up at me, his eyes welled with feeling. I do. He said. I offered him a faint smile, hoping to reassure him that we will be fine. As I sat there, I sensed a flicker of hope that we might be able to move on from this, but at my core I was aware it would require time in the following days. We spoke quietly, but the atmosphere was tense. Henry maintained his distance, and I attempted to act as if everything were normal, but the truth burdened me. I hoped that recognizing the situation and establishing limits would benefit us both advance, yet something deep within informed me that the silence separating us was not sufficient to mend what had been broken at that time. On the last night, I turned in early, drained from a day spent attempting to prevent my thoughts from spiraling. The house was still, and the coolness of the night air I wafted gently through my open window attempted to allow the rhythmic hum of the fan lull me to sleep. Yet my mind wouldn't. I must have dozed off at some point, as the next thing I knew I was being roused from slumber by the noise as my door creaked open. My heart jumped while I blinked in the dark, attempting to me ausrichten. Wee Henry's stimme klang. It was hardly a whisper, but unmistakable nonetheless. I propped myself up and went for the lamp on the nightstand. The warm glow illuminated the room. Making Henry, who stood there hesitantly visible, he appeared uncertain in the doorway. Henry the one, with his hands fidgeting at his side, said, my voice thick with sleep and bewilderment. "What are you up to?" He advanced slowly into the room, his movements, and he said he couldn't sleep deliberately. In silence, I only required to see you. My my chest tightened as I attempted to steady my breathing. I said in my voice that it was late. "Firmer, you need to return to bed now, understand?" he stated, his gaze fastening onto me, but I was unable to stop thinking about everything. I threw my legs over the edge. Henry, I was sitting upright on the bed. Thoughts of you crossed my mind as well, but we conversed regarding this. I softly expressed my love for you, yet this is not something we can discuss. He took another step about anymore, his expression forward a blend of, I am aware of determination and vulnerability. I know it's wrong, but I can't control my feelings. Seine Stimme zitternd sagte er, Du bist er, the only person who has truly been present. You've always shown that you care about me in a manner that was unique to me. My throat was constricted while I attempted to find the appropriate words. Henry, as your dad, I care about you. Stated with conviction that my role is to do so, but the manner you sense that it's unhealthy, it is. Correct. For a moment he stood there, his shoulders drooping under the burden of my words settled over him. I'm sorry, he said softly with tears glistening in his eyes. I simply didn't know what other way to let you know. My heart broke at the sight of him, but I compelled myself to stay composed. All is well to feel confused, Henry, I said, but this is something you need to process, and I will assist you as your father, but only as your father. The phrasing seemed off since I definitely wanted something different, and I could tell that there was disappointment in his eyes that made me remorseful about my choice. He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. I want to keep you, he voiced with little volume. He stated, you won't. I gave him my assurance, but we need to move. Henry forward for the two of us, and when those words were uttered, something in me shifted in an instant. I posed the question to myself, who am I? Why can't I simply assist my son with whatever he wants? He's my son. It hurt me to realize how let down by my words he was, and I no longer wanted it, and besides, I find the idea of what he wanted too. Perhaps because I also missed Barbara a lot, and so, after a brief moment of silence, I said, You know that he came here as I invited him to sit next to me? He came closer to me, and I could see him opening up to me again as I leaned in. I said it while looking into the eyes he leaned in towards me as well. And then it occurred. We kissed each other. It was like a bomb of tension exploded. There it was so good that I ensured that the kiss became deeper. And after a minute or two, he reached back and he stopped kissing. Not because he was in doubt or something noir, will er anfing mich in locations where only Barbara had caught me prior to, and, as you might be able to tell, we went even beyond that. I hope you understand now why I mentioned this was the wildest yet most thrilling night of my life. It was incredible after we both once it was done. A lengthy silence ensued. Are you all right? He replied. Yes, don't be concerned about me. Answered for a considerable time, I believe. 10-2. The room was silent for 20 minutes, except for the slight humming of the fan. Then Henry went to the door. He turned and walked towards W, stopped in the entrance, and looked back at me. Good night, Dad, he said, his voice loaded with feeling. Good night, Henry. I responded, mein Herz schmerzte. Während ich ihn ansah, leave, thanks for all I have to. He said, thank you, Dad. When the door clicked shut after him, I released a quaking breath, the strain in my torso at last relaxing. I reclined and gazed at the ceiling like the events of the past. In the few weeks that replayed in my mind, I knew we still had a long journey ahead. But for the first time, I experienced a glimmer of hope that we might locate our route back to finally, the healthier relationship the tension had broken. And the following morning, Henry joined quietly, but with composure, me at breakfast, and while the conversation was casual. I could feel a change in his demeanor. He appeared more at relax, as if he had at last released part of the burden he had been bearing during the next few weeks. Things started to Henry began to spend more time with others, which made him feel more normal. Increased time with friends and his focus returned to school, and his plans for the future we had not discussed what had recurred yet. The tacit it was evident that we comprehended each other as we sat on. We were both attempting to move on. The one on the porch watching the sunset that evening, Henry faced me and remarked, "Thanks for your patience with me, Dad. Thank you for all that you do for and with me. I appreciate you accepting me for who I am and assisting me with every aspect, even on aspects where fathers typically don't assist." I looked at him in surprise, their son, but moved by his words. I placed my hand on his arm. Of course, I said, "That's what dads do." He smiled, and for the first it felt like time had stood still. Authentic at that instant, I realized it will be fine. I still have my doubts concerning my actions since it occurred. It's occurred a few more times even, and in addition, I enjoy it myself as well. I know I assist Henry a lot. Maybe it's simply that we both want to create in favor of Barbara's loss, or perhaps it's another thing I didn't realize I had to narrate the tale to a person to become acquainted with. I should stop listening to what other people think. Carrying this out together with Luke, or is it perhaps even more normal than I consider what you think about it? Please inform me in the comments, it would thank you. That helped me a lot.